Welcome to Platform Diaries with Shane Williams, where each fortnight you'll hear the stories of industry veterans and learn the secrets to sustainably amplifying value from your software platform investments.
Story, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Story told us what to hang on to. That was a quote from Lisa Cron, the author of Wired for Story. Today's guest knows all too well the power of storytelling to unlock platform investments and drive digital transformation. Welcome to Platform Diaries. I'm your host, Shane Williams. Brooke Bainbridge is Business Development and Digital Transformation Manager for Australia and New Zealand at BP Castrol. We discuss, amongst a lot of things, the key elements of telling a story in a business and offer some practical tools to enable your next pitch. I trust you'll enjoy the interview. So, Brooke, welcome to Platform Diaries.
Thanks, Shane. Excited to be here.
So today's conversation, I want to touch on what I believe is your superpower, and that's the importance of storytelling, and particularly in platform leadership and the many different audiences that we have to, be able to tell our story to. And so before we jump into that, Brooke, I'd really love if you could just spend a minute or so just giving the audience a bit of a sense of who you are, a bit about your career journey and what you do now.
Sure. So I've currently been at the BP Group just under 10 years now, 9 years. I'm currently Business Development and Digital Manager for Australia and New Zealand in the Castrol business, which is the BP lubricants business. I'm about 10 months in, so feels very fresh to me still and completely new to the lubricants world. So big learning curve, but, really big agenda ahead. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. But my background across BP has been quite diverse, actually. So I started in supply chain procurement sort of roles, moved into offer development marketing roles, dealing with large mining companies in WA, responding to all the tenders for the BP Group. So had a really solid understanding of what we needed to do in order to win business. From there, moved across into commercial sales roles, so actually selling the product, which I recommend everyone should have a sales role in their career. I just think it's awesome. And then from there, I've done a couple of more strategic roles. My two recent roles have been on the leadership team, driving more that strategic sales, partnerships, future, more 3 to 5 years out. Where are we trying to get to? So that's me in a nutshell, Shane.
Awesome. And it's interesting that you say that you think everybody should have a sales role. I almost feel like in many respects, almost all roles have a sales element. And I think that's probably akin to today's topic in terms of how do you tell a story and how do you convince someone, or how do you, bring somebody on a journey. But maybe to that end, we'll roll back to the beginning of the story if we're going to talk about storytelling. And so I did a little bit of research, and it might sound a bit creepy, but I looked into your past and found out you actually grew up in country Victoria in Gippsland. And if I'm right, I think you grew up in and around a pub. And I was thinking about that. I think about my experiences in sort of country pubs, and particularly I spent some time in North Queensland, and I really enjoyed, getting up and amongst the country pubs in the tablelands and so forth. And I think about what's unique about that experience. And I was always fascinated with the sort of real, genuine characters that you would find in some of these establishments. And there was always this sort of stereotypical person who could really tell a good yarn. And whether the yarn was true or not was largely irrelevant. It was just someone who was entertaining, who could hold a room and, really sort of entertain the bar. And I now look at these ads that you see on TV at the moment, and apologies for people who aren't necessarily in Victoria, but there's a brand of beer that has a ad campaign on at the moment that's talking about, and the brand is Furphy, and so it's this concept of people telling tall tales at the bar. But I wonder if you could talk to me about what you do now, and then how relating that back to your early days in country Victoria. Do you really identify with that stereotype of the storyteller, and does that draw out in any of your work today?
I think it does. In ways, Shane, for sure. So you're absolutely right around you're stalking, so you've done well. So I did grow up around country pubs. So my parents had pubs for about 10 or 15 years. In between there, they actually started with one and then bought a couple of others and did them up and then ended up selling them off. And we moved to Queensland actually for a stint as well. So growing up around the pub was awesome actually. It was great fun. I remember I had my 8th birthday, my entire school year my grade got invited to the pub for my birthday. So that was cool, and we had a disco in the nightclub out the back. But I have really strong memories of going to the pub actually when I was younger and talking to the locals, and yeah, very authentic and very genuine people, just very salt of the earth, great people. And I think whether it's helped me today, I think it's, we were talking just briefly before we started recording, Shane, around, what I think my superpower is, which is such a, quite a confronting and awkward question. But I think it's centered around people and relationships. And I can absolutely attribute that to my upbringing at the pubs or around the pubs for sure. So, I had my first job doing the wages for Dad. I remember that. And then, I got promoted up to the beer fridges and stocking the spirits in the nightclub. And then from there, out actually on the ground talking to customers. And that's when I actually just fell in love with business and people. And I thought I want to do this forever. And hence why, I mentioned earlier around the sales role, because I think everyone should understand why we're actually here. And it's always for a customer, always. So it's about, even if it's an internal program we're trying to implement, it's to, either lower cost to serve, it's to make us work smarter, faster, more productively, for a positive customer experience. Generally, I think you can always link it and map it back to a customer. It can be a bit of a trap sometimes if you lose sight of that. And I think a lot of us and a lot of our companies and our peers do at times. So I think it's really been important for me in that way for sure.
And I think that's an interesting point about the customer, because I think often in the tech space, we can, whilst we claim to be customer focused, we can often lose sight of that. I think it's, I can't remember who said it, and I'm kicking myself now because I'd love to be able to sound really clever and quote them. But if you're not serving the customer, you're serving somebody who is. I think it's always a really solid mantra for the tech teams who are enabling, if you like, the sales teams. Thank you for sharing your background, and I think that's. Let's talk now about the part of your story when we first met, which was when you were in that sort of early stages of your CRM migration program in your previous role. And I recall you telling me a story about how you had to kind of garner support for that. It wasn't necessarily a project that was, as I recall, spun up in Australia. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you went about securing support for that piece of work?
Yeah, I can. It's quite funny how it ended up coming about. But if I take it back maybe 12, even 18 months ahead of that, I guess that sign off being given to start the project, there was a lot of work that we needed to do within our sales business. And I had been put in a newly, developed, it was a brand new role, National Business Development Manager. And, obviously I'm tasked with leading a team to help drive sales. Let's build lead generation around the business, new offers, new customers, just bring them in the door, Brooke, And the first thing I realized, I was like, we do not have a CRM. So we had a very old Siebel version. There was people in the business that probably thought we had a CRM, but it definitely wasn't a fit for purpose, what we needed. So it was my first, I guess, passionate campaign that I stuck with, Shane, in terms of creating, I guess, a bit of a internal PR campaign as to why we needed a CRM, and that was Salesforce, in my opinion, was the one to go for. So it was a process. To me, Salesforce or a CRM tool, it's a huge enabler. It enables so many different things within your business, not just sales. And it's a key part of the digital roadmap in my perspective. So that's where it started. It was the campaign to get it onto the roadmap. I finally did get it onto the roadmap. And then from there, it really was around how do you tell that story? And it's a lot easier once it's on the roadmap to sell that story in, but getting it on the roadmap is the challenge. And so, I like to use various different data points. So customer data points, competitive landscape, adjacent industries or completely unrelated industries, and how are they doing it really, really well. It doesn't have to be direct competitors. I think there's real magic sometimes in, cross-pollination of innovation between different markets. And how can you, it's all about educating those that are less aware or less passionate. Everyone cares about their own stuff, right? So if someone doesn't care about CRM and as passionate as I am, how can I make them get it and understand the value for the business? So that's sort of what I did. I went through a process of helping people understand how it was really going to change our business fundamentally from the core. And then from there, it's just the management, and not even management, but engagement of your stakeholders, so that when the timing is right to get the buy-in or to get, the internal credit card or whatever it be, it just logically makes sense at the time, because it's not the first time people are hearing about it. They know the value it's going to bring. It's really tightly linked to the strategy and it's on the roadmap, and it all just makes sense. But it's pre-work, and it does take time. And I think if I look back, that process did take 12 months. And there was one thing I do remember we did in a sales conference. We had our salespeople rank the biggest bang for buck initiatives we could go after to really change the dial in our business. And CRM ranked number one. And that was national, across our business at the time, all the national sales managers. And that was very powerful, Shane. So when, we talk about storytelling, and I'm sure we'll get into it a bit throughout our chat, being able to show to the senior leadership team or whoever, that this is the number one thing that our team needs to sell. It's just another data point. So it doesn't have to be necessarily something in an Excel spreadsheet, but it's still data.
Yeah. And that's interesting. You've mentioned data a couple of times, because that's where my head was going, which is, the power of storytelling, but using sort of metrics or some sort of data point that makes sense. I reflect on, and I talked about this in the book, I used to have a boss who was the ultimate storyteller and the ultimate networker, and the king of getting something across the line, very similar to the sort of the process you described, which is bringing stakeholders on the journey, communicating often. And one of the things he would always talk about is, what are the three numbers that I can put into people's heads that they're going to remember? What are the three metrics that they're going to be able to repeat that is going to garner that buy-in, so I can get people to start telling my story for me with three data points that make a hell of a lot of sense, that are repeatable, but they're true. And then you mentioned data a couple of times and it sort of resonated, and I thought, you're right. I mean, the whole reason I talked about building a narrative and building those relationships and working your network in the book was exactly that reason. And I think that's probably a good segue into my next question that I had for you, which was, in my experience, there's obviously multiple stakeholder groups. You kind of talked about that. And each one of them, in some respects, needs its own narrative or a derivative of the narrative. But at least in my experience, the story tends to begin with who's paying the bill, where's the money coming from. And I described in the book also this concept of the executive stakeholder, that one person who's going to be the champion for the investment. And I imagine there's probably one, if not several, stories that are needed to try to garner the support of the people who are paying the bill and then maintain it throughout the journey. Does that resonate for you? Or, how would you tackle that?
Yeah, as in different, there's always going to be a different, I was going to say a different story, but it's not necessarily a different story, actually. It's being very consistent with your story. Always. So when you sort of mentioned that your previous boss had said 3 data points, I love that, because simplicity, I think, is so underrated in terms of effectiveness. If you are clear in what you're communicating or what you're trying to get across, it's very easy to remember and for people to understand, what you're about and what you're trying to do. So I think it's being, really, really clear, and less is more, but being very tailored to who you're talking to. So what is the person that you're talking to actually wanting to get out of this? What's actually in it for them? How does it make their life easier? And tailor your data accordingly. So what your VP of sales is going to want to see, or your CEO, versus someone that's going to implement or be a user of the technology, is going to be totally, totally different. And buy-in for both is actually very, very important, because I would argue getting the credit card is the easy part in some cases, and actually getting the adoption and the benefit out of the project or the technologies, that's the second challenge. And how do you tailor your story? So you have to know what their drivers are going to be, and that's, I suppose, the brilliance, and people that are great at influencing, they can do that. They know how to do that really well.
So if I was to paraphrase, it'd be consistency in the narrative, but then working out for lack of a better term, the data point that's relevant to the audience for what's in it for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also like to always give context in terms of leading into an ask, or asking for a decision or support on something. This front load the context. So what's actually happening? I can think of if you want to use the Salesforce example, that's quite easy to articulate what a lack of a solid CRM, the impact that could have on your business. I think it's really easy to articulate that. I can think of another example at work where I've used this, I guess I've used this strategy at the moment, and it's painting a picture of the scene right now, and it's not good in this particular scenario. And that is telling a story, but less words, but less numbers and data as well. Be really, really crisp. You might only have 4 or so reference points on that slide if you're using a presentation or speech or whatever, but they're really key, important things that lead into the why you're asking for what you're asking.
So I think you've touched on a couple of key elements of what I think makes up a really good story and a convincing story. And you talked about data and so forth, but I wonder whether I could, rather than putting words in your mouth, so I could sort of ask you to perhaps summarize what you think the key elements of not just a story, but a convincing story are, and what do you think those are?
Yeah, look, I think there's 3 elements that are really effective in driving change. And if I think most of your listeners, Shane, are in the IT space, and change is constant in your world, right? So I feel like this is always going to be something that your listeners will be needing to do in their day jobs, or for the most part. But I think we touched on it being really, really clear. So less is always more, I think. So don't fill up slides and don't overtalk for the sake of talking. Just say what you need to say, and say it in as less words possible. So be very, very clear. I love to use a diagram or a visual instead of words when you have the chance as well. I just think, not everyone, some people are visual learners as well and take information in and absorb information in other ways. So I'm just very mindful of that. So being really, really clear, backed by data. So we've spoken about data already, but data can take the form of many different things. So is it that we're optimizing a process and the data output of what that looks like? Is it customer-centric data? So is it marketing research that is telling us we need to do something? Is it opportunity cost, and somehow we've been able to quantify what that looks like? Know when to use what metrics for what audience and what, depending on what you're trying to deliver. But data is key. If you don't have data, you're going to lose the finance people straight away to start with. So I've found if you can tell the vision and the story of where you need to go from a business strategy perspective, and then you've got the data to back it, to get the support of those functional teams in your business that want to see that level of detail. And it also helps those critical minds, and they think, it sort of helps them get over some hurdles when they see data to back up an ask. And then my third point would just be the internal PR. So almost, I think they're all equally weighted in some ways, but the internal PR and knowing who your stakeholders are and relationships, and doing the pre-work. So it's not about, we need this now, so all of a sudden now I'll engage. It's about playing the long game with some of this stuff, and being authentic in the way you do that, of course. People feel if it's not. But having those key relationships with people that you're going to need to influence, and making sure that you're consistent in, your messaging with them over a period of time. So that comes back to priorities, as I said earlier, and less being more. If you're talking about 20 different things every time you get to speak to your vice president for 15 minutes, they're going to walk away completely confused about, what you're trying to achieve. Whereas if every time I talk to Shane, I'm talking about this Salesforce that's on the roadmap and the digital roadmap, it's really unexpected and makes real logical sense when Shane comes to me for for some funding related to that project. So it's, it's also about no surprises. So when, I've gone into many sort of meetings, I suppose, where we've been asking for endorsement for some big change in the organization. And the biggest lesson and takeaway I've probably ever taken away from my career to date is around pre-engagement. So with big decisions, don't let it be the first time that they've heard about that when you walk into that room asking for that decision. If you have a cross-functional team there and you haven't brought in finance ahead of that meeting, you don't want finance to be throwing curveballs in that meeting. You want to know finance's concerns up front so you can build that in and make sure that their concerns are alleviated. So there's a lot of benefits from engaging, and I would argue about, over engaging versus under.
So if I was to try and summarize that, it would be, I wrote a couple of notes here. Let me know if I got them all. So I said, less is more, use a visual, backed by data, and I put 3 data points, and I know that was something that I brought up, but I backed with data. Know your audience, consistency in message, and no surprises. Do you reckon I got it?
Yeah. The no surprises one, like that's huge for me, because you want to have time to iron that out if there's an issue there, and not only that, you get some really key. Like, we don't know everything, right? So having engagement sessions with the different teams or stakeholders is beneficial in a range of reasons, actually. It's not just so that they get buy-in to, or that you've got their support to endorse a project. It might actually be that they highlight a really big risk that you hadn't even been on your radar, that you weren't even aware of, and now you've got an opportunity to mitigate it or whatever. So I think that's pretty good.
Right. So now something you and I talked about once before is that I guess the art of strategic leadership is not just storytelling, but it's kind of that being inspirational and setting a vision. Do you still believe that's fair?
Yes, absolutely. Now for me more than ever, I just think it's almost what gets me up now in the morning. It's how can I help motivate my team and my peers to actually turn this ship where we want it to go. And I think it's all vision. I think you've got to get the balance right of long term and near term. But if you look back in time, people that have inspired you, Shane, it's generally their vision. And you're like, I want to work for them. I want to be on their ship, I
think that's fascinating that you talk about the value of a vision and something that people can get behind, and asking me to reflect on the leaders of the past that have had a narrative that I can support. And I wonder whether we could kind of spitball for a second about how to make this real for technology groups, because I think the more I reflect on it, and I know you and I have talked about this in the past, is there's an opportunity here for the future leaders of technology to, for lack of a better term, be less about the tech, if you like. Like, there's engineering, smart technical people in the organisation that can deliver, but I think leadership is now an opportunity and time to step up and get better at some of the more commercial and strategic focuses of the organisation to tie it together. And so when we think about vision and inspiration and storytelling, someone who's come from the non-technology background into the space, you got any thoughts, perspectives, or advice for aspiring tech leaders?
Yeah, I think visionary leadership is the leadership style to adapt or to use when wanting or needing to drive change. I personally think it's most effective. People are inherently scared of change. People hate it, right? Tech is a great example of that. People resist tech. And I'm not talking your early adopters here. I'm talking the median, the middle of your bell curve. They're big resistors of change, and people also don't understand technology. A lot of people. So I think there's a real art to be mastered, and especially relevant for your audience in terms of how can you tell the story so that it makes so much sense to, the other business units, functions, your peers on the leadership team, and it makes absolute crisp sense how it's linked to the roadmap and the future direction of the business. If you actually think about IT and the way the future is going in terms of roadmaps, I know the roadmaps I'm looking at, and they're 70% digital enablement, tech enablement, cloud-based, software-based. So I would argue it should absolutely be a focus for your audience. If you're not familiar with, visionary leadership or even around storytelling, there's so many podcasts on the topic. Get on YouTube. That's actually how I was introduced to it. A boss sent me an article from Harvard Business Review, and I thought I've got to try this because, I was coming up with a few headwinds and challenges, and it's worked really well. So I think, it comes back to your, the 3 points we mentioned earlier, Shane, and just being really clear. So if you can be super clear on how that technology or innovation or whatever it be is actually going to help the business in less technical terms, then I think it could absolutely be like magic, really.
So it sounds to me like there's a lesson in here for technology leaders. And, I guess this concept of it's not just about being able to understand tech and how it can be manipulated to enable business, but there's this kind of, coming back to our superpower of storytelling, there's almost this opportunity for the next level of leadership to kind of learn some of the lessons from the non-technologists in the organization, to be able to create a vision and create a movement behind which the organization can stand, so that when you talk about, the people that are resistant to change, the vast majority who are not necessarily technically au fait, but can get behind the outcome and the vision that you're trying to achieve. I guess what would be interesting is, have you seen it done well? Or, what does good look like?
Yeah, I have seen it done well. There's one person that really comes to mind. He was the CIO at BP. He was there when I joined, and I've been there close to 10 years, and I think he'd probably have another 10 minimum on top of me there. But if I think back of my time interacting with Danny and the way he was, he was so technically brilliant in terms of what he knew around technology and innovation and all of what that encompasses. But he never at all, you never left confused is actually a really good way to summarize it. You always took away what the benefits were going to be, what the risks, in very plain English, what the risks would be. And he was just able to articulate where that piece of, tech or development or whatever could get you as a business. And it comes back to that, visionary sort of leadership storytelling that we've been talking about earlier. And I think, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and there was a reference. It was a guy from Microsoft, and he was mentioning that organizations are human. And I just thought that was really fitting for our conversation today, actually, because it ties into, storytelling elicits emotion. That's what it does. And, when you can combine that emotional pull and motivation for the future with just, your logic and your data, I think it's a pretty powerful combo. So yeah, I think he really, really nailed it. Comes back to, again, being really clear and simple. That was one of the 3 that I summarized earlier. It's about being clear in articulating what something is too. So I think, it's really applicable in different situations.
And that's awesome that you've got sort of a current relevant example of what good looks like. So I think we talk about this sort of abstract concept that, technologists, to bridge the gap into executive leadership roles, need to be able to, tell a story and humanize it and whatnot. And there's a demonstration of someone who's actually achieving that really well and bringing non-technologists along for the journey. Just to kind of wrap that up, if I was somebody who aspired to do that, or perhaps I thought I was doing it well, what do you reckon that looks like? I'm thinking, for example, in your non-technology role, are you bringing this person into the room for team meetings, or are they coming to client meetings? Like, at what level do you know that you've nailed it? What level of engagement do business stakeholders bring you into the tent for?
It's a really good question, because if I look at my role right now, I'm fighting for a lot of the tech. And I'm not a tech person. I'm not an IT, part of an IT team specifically. I do have digital in my title, I suppose. So maybe that is my role. But that's, to me, if I was to build an organizational structure from the ground up, I want someone from the tech team in my team. So I suppose reflecting on an ideal world, I would have a very, very close contact in my working life that sits in an IT sort of role to help me, because I'm not the expert. So that's where I suppose my answer is not at an individual level, but it's more at a macro level as organizations. There's probably, and this may evolve. I feel like we're just at the start of the digital sort of world. So as this all progresses and we get deeper into it, hopefully this evolves. But yeah, I think that's a real gap right now. Don't you think? I feel like you've got the business and you've got IT, and they still sit quite separately. And I think there's a real role to be more integrated. I think that could be really, really effective in business.
I think certainly in certain markets, I think if it was a technology business at heart, then perhaps that gap is somewhat closed. But I think in many sort of more traditional and larger organisations, I definitely see that there is often still a IT's over here and businesses over here, and the language kind of dictates that to some respect. So that there's the business and IT, and I think it's when it becomes, the business of technology, and we're having a conversation around business outcomes through tech as opposed to via, then I think that would be the measure of success. How you get there and what that looks like. You're right. I think perhaps it's the bridge. And maybe it's the non-technologists becoming interested in tech and bridging that gap, rather than the technologists who are transforming to become more business focused, or some sort of Venn diagram where there's a crossover in the middle. I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And that just got me, I guess, listening to you speak. I lead a couple of agile squads in the business. And I thought, actually, I've sort of contradicted myself a little bit there, because we actually work quite closely when we're working in agile squads. And that's a great example of where I think we nail it. But, there's still a lot of businesses that aren't running agile. But maybe that's a case too.
And maybe
or a case for it.
Or maybe that's a topic for another podcast.
Yeah, that's true.
All right. So I would normally, at this point, given we're up on time, ask you for your 3 pieces of advice. But I kind of feel like we've covered this through the journey. I feel like I think we started with 3, but we've got kind of like the 6 key elements of a good story, and then we've got the making technology human and understanding that businesses are human by design, and therefore creating a movement and setting the scene behind which people can, sort of rally and see what's in it for them. Have you got any other tips for telling a convincing story to secure buy-in?
I think telling a story, as I said earlier, it elicits emotion. And I think, as we've already touched on, organizations are human. People make the culture of the business. So if we're trying to lift energy, raise energy, inspire our teams, inspire our stakeholders, all of that, I think just try injecting it into a few of your, run a few experiments and run a few little meetings or pitches, trying it and see the difference in buy-in or impact or responsiveness, and be really tightly linked to your business partner's goals, because there's no point going and putting something up that is completely unrelated, I suppose, to where the business is trying to go, because you'll face blockers straight away. So I think be really tight about why you want to do what you're trying to do, and if you can stack on that emotional element and getting people to buy into the change, then I think it's just way more powerful than the data itself. And then the other lasting piece of advice from me is just to be obsessed with your customer. So if you don't have a customer, and I'm talking the customer who buys our products or our services, the end user customer, try to have them at the heart of everything you're doing and inject their voice into the room at any opportunity. And I think that's quite powerful as well. So that's one thing I'm very passionate about, and it probably didn't get a lot of airtime today, but I just think, bringing that customer into the story as well, wherever you can, that's customer centricity. And I would argue most of our, digital companies today are quite customer centric, and I think that's key.
Thank you, Brooke. That's awesome. We're up on time. Something that I reflected on, just what you said there about being able to, tell the story and share the outcome. Something I put in the book. If anyone's looking for something that's practical that you could use to sort of implement some of the stuff we talked about today, in the book I talk about it, but it's not my idea. It's something that Amazon's been using for years, is what they call the working backwards process, if you like. And it's largely to build a press release for what a new product or a new feature or this new thing that you want to do looks like. And if you think about the structure of a press release, is very much the, what is it, who is it for, what are the benefits? And it's about selling that, because it would eventually go out to, the point of the press release is to try and garner media coverage. And so, I use it in the book, but I think it's really effective in platform teams to be able to, get your executive and your senior stakeholders rallied around a proposal that you want to put forward, or something that you want to bring to the organization that perhaps they haven't asked for. Check it out. Look it up on Google. It's called Working Backwards, the Amazon methodology. But before we go, very quickly, if there's people listening who would like to get in touch and learn a little bit more about your perspective on storytelling or anything, how should they reach you?
LinkedIn's probably the best way, Shane. So Brooke with an E and Bainbridge, Bain Bridge. I'm on LinkedIn, and if you just want to shoot me a message, I'd be more than happy to have a chat.
Brooke, thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure, and I've really enjoyed today's discussion. It's a little bit offbeat for what we normally talk about, which is pretty cool, and a good way to sort of wrap up the year. So thanks very much. We'll talk again soon.
Cool. Thank you, Shane.
You've been listening to Platform Diaries with Shane Williams. For more information or to contact Shane, please visit shanewilliams.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.